right off the bat is apologize. We've got the perfect weather day today, according to Minnesota standards. So let's appreciate it. Who knows, we could have snow tomorrow or next week. So again, we will say, you know, if you get hot, please take a moment to step outside, get some fresh air, come back in. But we certainly are looking forward to a fabulous evening based on the topic that we are going to be enjoying. So just to kick us off, on behalf of Stand Up Minnesota and the Stand Up Minnesota Learning Academy, we are really pleased that we have such a huge turnout tonight. Thank you so much for coming. I can't think of a more applicable subject for us today. I think between last Monday, Thursday, today's what, Tuesday?
Yeah.
I've lost track. How many impeachable offenses do we think we can cover today? We'll see, right? So as we try to translate the complexities of every new occurrence that's coming out of the White House, on a daily basis almost, we've heard descriptions such as Nixonian, we've heard unprecedented, and we won't even dare say it. Somebody, I think, heard presidential. It makes you scratch your head, right? But we are incredibly honored this evening. I think in times when the calls for impeachment are absolutely the loudest, we have to call on those that are wisest among us to help us answer some of the questions and to help navigate that maze. So I am going to say David Schultz. He's well known. He is a Hamline Professor of Political Science and the University of Minnesota Professor of Law, a three-time Fulbright Scholar who has taught extensively in Europe, and the winner of the National Leslie A. Whittington Award for Excellence in Public Affairs Teaching. He's the author of 30 books and over 100 articles on various aspects of American politics, election law, the media, and politics. He's regularly interviewed and quoted in the local, national, and international media on these subjects, including in New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, The Economist, NPR, and a few well-known international publications. His most recent books are American Politics in the Age of Ignorance, Why Lawmakers Choose Belief Over Research in 2013. Election Law and the Democratic Theory, 2014, and Presidential Swing States, Why Only 10 Matter in 2015. So again, everyone, please give your warmest Stand Up Minnesota welcome to Professor David.
Thank you very much for having me tonight. And what I want to do tonight is I have some thoughts that I want to put together in terms of what I'm calling sort of the Constitution and the coming impeachment of Donald Trump. But what I want to sort of put together here tonight is to make an argument and say that if we think about the problems that Trump and the Trump administration is facing, there's a whole range of them, and clearly I could spend hours and hours going through all of them. And as I was sort of sitting in my car tonight, before I came in here thinking about it, I said that there are the legal problems that Trump faces, or more importantly, the legal issues that he doesn't even understand some of the legal issues that he faces, and I'll explain that in a second here. There are clearly the ethical issues surrounding, of course, his conflicts of interest. There's the political issues. There is the what I call the governance issues. And then what I'm going to focus in on are some of the constitutional issues surrounding really, impeachment. But there's a story I want to tell to start off my talk tonight. And some of you know that that I work election night at KARE 11. I get there about 4 o'clock on election day, and they let me go home around 7 or 8 in the morning. For those of you who are insomniacs, you might know that about 1 in the morning, well, actually earlier than that, they send Julie Nelson, Randy Shaver home around 10:30, after the 10 o'clock news, because they're the anchors. They need to get their beauty rest. They send them off so they can get to sleep. It doesn't matter about me. So I get to stay there all night, and I actually get to anchor KARE 11 like 1 in the morning or something like that. So 4 years from now, or 3 years from now, if you actually want to see me anchor at 1 in the morning, it's a pretty ugly sight. It truly is. But I say this because about 7 in the morning, 7:30 in the morning, when KARE 11 finally let me go, you might recall they're over off General Mills Boulevard, off of 394. I gave my wife a call just to sort of let her know that I was alive and breathing. And I said to her, there's something really amazing on 394. She says, what's that? And I said, there are no tanks in the street, and there are no police and barbed wire out. And of course, at first I think she was just humoring me by saying, okay, sure, David, I understand, thinking I was really tired. But she got the point that I was making. And the point that I was trying to make at the end of the day is that there's something really amazing that Trump was going to start to discover at some point, or at least we hope he would discover, and it's this amazing thing called the Constitution that has these really cool things in there called separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, and this really nasty thing called the Bill of Rights, among other things. And I said that Trump would start to confront the Constitution at some point and realize that, in fact, the presidency is limited by powers, limited by the Constitution, that there are no inherent presidential powers. And as we saw with his two Muslim bans, immigration bans, and with a sanctuary city ban, the courts have agreed. And they are basically starting to sort of tighten on him the notion of saying that, in fact, the Constitution does matter and that he's going to have to follow it. Well, where I want to kick in our discussion of the Constitution tonight is really in terms of something that people have been talking about almost from day one, which is impeachment. Now, clearly, there's no question that on January 20th, when lots of people started saying impeach Donald Trump, some of it was sort of partisan carping, some of it was sort of, you know, the kind of stuff that you see on Facebook, you know, which I don't know about you, you know, I dismiss about 90% of what I see on Facebook, you know, although the stuff about space aliens, UFO abductions, you know, Elvis Presley sightings, I do think are genuine or something. But you know, about 3 months ago, clearly I would argue that it was premature to talk about impeachment. And in fact, given the fact that we've only impeached 2 presidents in the United States and tried to do a 3rd one, you know, again, a lot of it we could sort of dismiss as again, sort of partisan, sort of sour grapes or carping. However, it's becoming more and more clear now that in fact there may be something going on here. In terms of it not just being partisan, but about the fact that we are dealing with something quite serious here. And my opening sort of thesis for tonight's discussion is that if in fact President Trump just removed FBI Director James Comey to impede his ability to investigate, you know, the Russian connection, as seems increasingly likely, as we saw late this afternoon, where we now have Comey in his own notes indicating that as early as back in February, that Trump asked him to knock it off. So if in fact the reason why Trump fired him last week was the purposes of trying to prevent an investigation from going forward, then guess what? That's probably grounds for impeachment because it meets the characteristics and the definition of what? Obstruction of justice. And so I'm going to make the argument that we clearly have something there in terms of possible obstruction of justice, but I'm going to argue more than just that. I'm going to argue that it's not just about Comey, but there may be other reasons why Trump could be impeached. And so what I want to do tonight is focus on a couple of things. First, what I want to focus on is just a little bit of sort of, you know, since I'm a political science professor, I am a law professor, I teach constitutional law in law school, I have to do a little bit of teaching tonight. And a little bit of teaching is just to explain to everybody what exactly the impeachment process is. I mean, this will be easier than before the election where I had to explain to people what the Electoral College was. That's an incredibly hard topic, and to discuss it with a straight face with any kind of credibility. But here I want to walk us through a little bit in terms of sort of the legal history and sort of the structure of what impeachment is. Then eventually talk about what are the possible grounds for impeachment, you know, of Donald Trump. And my argument's going to be, it doesn't just have to be what? Obstruction of justice. It doesn't just have to be breaking the law. It could be something far broader than that or something very different than that. And eventually the argument will be is that there is evidence out there from what Old English history and law that in fact malfeasance, nonfeasance, and guess what? Perhaps just outright incompetence in governance could qualify as grounds for impeachment. And so at some point, my discussion of impeachment dovetails and comes back to what? Those legal, ethical, political, and governance issues, you know, that are all sort of part of a larger critique of where the Trump administration is right now. So that's going to be my goal here. And what I want to be able to do is to be able to cover this in a period of time so that I'll be able to sort of lay out my arguments. But the most important part, most fun part about tonight, I was about to say the funner part, most fun part tonight, I've been grading too many papers in the last couple of days. I'll tell you, in-class exams, for those of you who are teachers, in-class exams are not the prettiest things in the world to read. I will just tell you that. But what I want to do is leave plenty of time, obviously, for questions and answers and for dialogue, because I think that's the far more interesting aspect of what I'm going to do today than necessarily my presentation. So anyhow, my argument's going to be is that, we need to think about what does it mean to actually impeach somebody, and what does the whole impeachment process entail. And for us to do that, I have to pull out, as a good law professor, remember, our copy of the Constitution. And as all my students always laugh at me when I say, I always carry a copy of my Constitution, and I always turn to them and ask them, have they read their Constitution on a daily basis? And they all kind of, grimace at me and laugh or something like that. I say, no, seriously, it's probably worth reading once in a while or something like that to figure out what's going on in there. But Article 2, Section 4 is the process or the place that we really want to turn our attention. And Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution outlines the process for impeachment of presidents and other officers of the United States. I should also just mention, and we can come back and talk about this at some point tonight in terms of questions and answers, is that Article 2 of the Constitution, in general, outlines the powers of the presidency. And that's especially something that I think Donald Trump needs to read. Read in the sense of understanding what presidents are allowed to do in terms of remembering the fact that the Constitution, along with delegation of power from Congress, defines the scope of presidential power. As I've been reminding my students this semester, there is no such thing as inherent presidential power or extraterritorial power. To use a badly grammatical sentence here, I say to my students, if it ain't in the Constitution, if it ain't been delegated by Congress, presidents can't do it. And that's part of understanding something about the authority of presidents of the United States. But when we turn to Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution, it says that the President, Vice President, and other civil officers of the United States can be removed for office by impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And we're going to eventually come back and try to figure out what it means to say treason, bribery, high crimes and misdemeanors, and try to sort of wedge some of the Trump behavior into those three categories of terms there. But in terms of understanding the impeachment process, it's really, we need to sort of clarify that the impeachment process is actually a two-stage process out here. There's first the actual voting of impeachment by the House of Representatives, and then there's the second stage, which is in the U.S. Senate. And usually when people say a president has been impeached, yeah, we've impeached 2 presidents of the United States already, but we have yet to remove a single president by convicting them of articles of impeachment. Okay, so what does all this mean? What it means simply is that what the House of Representatives has to do at some point is to basically vote by a majority on an article or articles of impeachment. Has to decide that there is some reason to conclude that they believe that the President of the United States has done something wrong, treason, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors, and therefore merits removal from the President, from the office of the presidency. Now, as I mentioned to you, we've done that 2 times in American history. The first time was with Andrew Johnson right after Reconstruction. And I think with Andrew Johnson, it was 13 articles of impeachment that were voted against him. And most of those revolved around what was called the Office of Tenure Act, Tenure of Office Act, which basically said that before the President of the United States removed somebody from his cabinet, he had to get permission of the Senate. Now, there's a lot of debate on whether or not that law was actually constitutional or not. That was the official reason why they voted for articles of impeachment. Unofficial was the fact that, guess what? It's what we call the radical Republicans in the House of Representatives really wanted to push Reconstruction much further than Andrew Johnson was willing to go along with. And it was partly a policy dispute, partly the fact that, guess what, Andrew Johnson was not exactly the most competent president we apparently had, but a whole bunch of reasons out there. But at least on the surface, what we had was the notion of saying that Andrew Johnson had violated a law of Congress and therefore merited removal from office. And that's important because presidents who refuse to enforce the law, who refuse to do what Congress has delegated them to do, that's good enough of a reason, I will argue, for removing presidents of the United States. And so we can come back to that. So Andrew Johnson, articles of impeachment were voted against him. Additionally, we know that back when Bill Clinton was president of the United States, that was the second president of the United States to be impeached. At the end of the day, just to sort of clarify, what the main article of impeachment was, is that actually, it's a wonderful story that I like to tell my students here about a waste of taxpayer dollars. Is that you might recall that once Clinton was president, him and his wife were investigated for dealings on a project called Whitewater Real Estate Development when Bill Clinton was governor of Arkansas. And there were concerns regarding whether or not that him and his wife, but especially he as governor of Arkansas, had used undue influence to try to profit in this Whitewater investment. Now, of course, it's important to remember something about the Whitewater investment. The Clintons lost money. The thing fell apart. So it's kind of hard to make the argument right off the bat that he's profited from using his office when the whole thing went belly up. But that's another story entirely. So anyhow, that's the ostensible reason why they started the investigation. Kenneth Starr, under the special prosecutor law, and we can kind of go into circles and talk about the special prosecutor law at some point also. Kenneth Starr was designated as a special prosecutor by a federal district court judge in Washington to investigate Whitewater. Well, as it kind of expanded, it turns out, guess what? There's really nothing going on with Whitewater. But we started to get these allegations, which unfortunately were true, that Bill Clinton had extramarital affairs and probably had propositioned, several of his staff members when he was governor of Arkansas. Eventually, it centers all around Paula Jones and a couple of other people. He is put on the stand under oath, testifies falsely regarding an affair, and what winds up happening at the end of the day is that Kenneth Starr concludes a $44 million taxpayer-funded investigation to conclude what? That Bill Clinton lied about having sex with a woman. Now, I am certainly not going to try to get into any kind of sexist statements here. I'm trying to step away from them as much as possible. But I'm not exactly sure at the end of the day that a guy lying about having sex with a woman, even President of the United States, is an impeachable offense. But yes, it is technically lying under oath. And so what happened is that he lied under oath, tried to cover it up, and the articles of impeachment against Bill Clinton were essentially all around that. And so we've got those two instances here. We also have a third instance with Richard Nixon where, I don't know about you, but I was 16 years old in 1974, glued to the television set. During the summer of '74 especially, watching the House and Senate, the House Judiciary Committee vote on the articles of impeachment. And eventually they voted, and I should point out, in an overwhelmingly bipartisan fashion. The votes were like 24-3, if I remember correctly, 25 to 5 or something like that, but overwhelming. And I just mention it because Watergate seems like a different era. We forget about a time when Howard Baker, a Republican from Tennessee, was the one who coined the phrase, what did the president know and when did he know it? And you saw the Republicans very aggressively going after Richard Nixon in terms of joining the Democrats. But as we know, what happened with Nixon is that he eventually, after the articles of impeachment were voted on by the House Judiciary, and before they were sent off to the entire House, Judge John Sirica ruled in a very important case, and then eventually the U.S. Supreme Court ruled. Because this is why it's so great with what's happened in the last week with Trump. This is bringing everything back. had been disclosed that, guess what, that there were White House tapes, if some might recall, and the House of Representatives, as well as Leon Jaworski, who was the special prosecutor, wanted those tapes to find out if, in fact, the president had done anything in terms of obstructing justice or trying to prevent a criminal investigation or covering up into the break-in of the Democratic National Headquarters in the Watergate building. Nixon says, I'm not turning any of this over. It's protected by executive privilege. John Sirica ruled against him. The case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. Nixon thinks, I'm going to win this one. Especially he thinks that, guess what, my Chief Justice is Warren Burger, who I appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. There's no way that Warren Burger is going to vote against me, and I've also appointed a couple of other people. They're not going to vote against me. 8-0, Nixon loses. Warren Burger writing the majority opinion saying that while executive privilege may exist as a principle of separation of powers, any privilege that the President of the United States has must give way to the needs of a pending criminal investigation. And this is important to understand here because, as I tell my law students, rarely, if those of you who are lawyers know this, rarely are there four-square precedents that support anything. U.S. versus Nixon is about as four-square of a precedent as you can get if Trump says, I am not turning over the tapes to the House, or I'm not turning those tapes over to anybody else. I mean, this is the easiest one to argue in the world. It wouldn't take too much effort to do it. So anyhow, the Supreme Court rules and says, give up the tapes. Nixon basically concedes, and 2 days later he resigns. So we never got to that point to where he actually gets impeached. But we had two where there were actually articles of impeachment voted. Remember, it takes the House of Representatives a majority vote to do that. Once the House has voted for impeachment, it's turned over to the Senate. The House has to designate a group of people from the House of Representatives who basically will present the case or present the prosecution of the impeachment to the Senate. And the Senate then will hear the articles of impeachment. Chief Justice presides over the impeachment proceeding, and then it requires a 2/3 majority of the Senate to actually impeach the President of the United States. And so think about the process here. Think of the House of Representatives voting on articles of impeachment as something similar to a grand jury indictment. You know, they have to sort of indict the president on high crimes and misdemeanors, treason or bribery. They then have to prosecute the case before the Senate, which acts kind of like a jury, and have to then actually show to the Senate's belief that, in fact, these are impeachable offenses. Now, unlike in criminal law would say that if you're going to convict somebody, you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. That would be our standard. We all know that from some kind of civics class or whatever. There is no clear constitutional standard that says what you have to prove to the Senate. We leave it up to the good graces, and we leave it up to hopefully the wise discretion of the Senate to decide whether or not somebody should actually be convicted. But in the case then of Andrew Johnson, the impeachment fails by 1 vote. I remember as a little kid, some of you probably do too, there used to be a guy on the radio named Paul Harvey. And I remember a Paul Harvey story talking all about the impeachment of Andrew Johnson failing by 1 vote because one senator who was going to probably vote in favor of impeachment couldn't get to Washington in time because of a snowstorm or something like that. And so it's a great, only Paul Harvey can tell the story because he says, for the want of a snowstorm, blah, blah, like that, et cetera, like that. Okay. In the case of Bill Clinton, it fell several votes short, and as we know, it was a straight party line vote in terms of what happened there. And so those are our 2 instances of where we've tried to do impeachment. Both of them have failed. Both of them revolving around what seems to be something approaching policy disputes or perhaps disagreements with the House of Representatives and Congress in the case of Johnson. 2, in the case of Clinton, I want to argue it had more to do with partisanship than it did with the merits in terms of what he actually did. Although I would argue that what he did lying under oath is not the right thing in the world to do, I would certainly say that this is probably in the larger scheme of things, not the worst thing in the world to do, but we can have a great debate regarding that. Okay, so we have, those are our two instances here. Now the question becomes, all right, what are the grounds? If that's the process, House has to vote, Senate has to convict, majority vote in the House, 2/3 vote in the Senate. As I mentioned to you, what Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution lays out are the reasons for impeachment. It is for treason, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors. So what do those three things mean? Well, treason is right off the bat the only crime that's actually defined in the U.S. Constitution. And in the Constitution it says that in order to find somebody guilty of treason for criminal purposes, and I think we can apply the same thing here at a constitutional level, you have to engage in war against the United States or provide aid and comfort to the enemy. And generally, if you're actually going to convict somebody in a criminal court for treason, it also requires the existence of two witnesses. And so it's a pretty significant standard out there. And so that's the first thing to understand. Treason is a high bar to meet, requiring, I would say, several different things. One, it might actually require, what? Waging war against the United States, you know. There's no indication, I would argue right now, that Trump has actually, let's say in the physical sense, of waged war against the United States. You know, in terms of rounding up the troops and saying, let's go attack the United States. That's a pretty high bar out there. But in terms of giving aid and comfort to the enemy, we can come back and talk about that at some point. If, for example, among things, as a story is starting to emerge today, that he has actually purposely and intentionally leaked, intelligence, to the Russians, or if in fact he conspired with the Russian government during the election and continues to do so in terms of, let's say, either trying to affect U.S. elections or trying to affect U.S. policy. Arguably, although maybe hard to make the case here, arguably, that could be giving aid and comfort to the enemy. Now, it makes it easier when it's the Russian Federation, perhaps. It might be harder to say that Canada is the enemy, although I don't know anymore with the way the Trump administration seems to be just finding the rest of the world. But somewhere out there, again, we can lay this out in more detail here, is that arguably that some of the actions that he's engaged in might very well be what? Might very well be giving aid and comfort to the enemy. Okay. The second is bribery. The second phrase is bribery. Bribery, generally understood, is accepting payments in return for the performance or conveyance of government services or favors. Our classic image of bribery is what? It's someone shows up with a sack of money, or a briefcase of money. I hand it to that person, and I say I'm going to do something in return. Without getting too local and too political, we'll just simply say we have a problem with that potentially in the St. Paul mayor's race. But I will stay away from that discussion right now for now, since I've been quoted way too much about that already. But if those allegations are true, that is a classic case of bribery. A quid pro quo that's out there. Now, given Trump's extensive business holdings across the world and his refusal to divest himself of them, there is a possibility that some of those conflicts of interest could rise to a constitutional level of a problem that would merit an impeachable offense under bribery. What could that be, for example? It could be, and we hear lots of allegations, a lot of this is rumor mill, some of this is, Facebook stuff, so we don't know how much of it's really true out there, partly because we don't have his tax returns, we don't have sort of really clear, reporting by him in terms of his economic holdings. But it could be a variety of different things. It could be, for example, there are rumors that he is making foreign policy decisions or visits based upon what? based upon where he has financial holdings across the world. And it could be perhaps something similar to what he was criticizing the Clinton Foundation, Hillary Clinton, about, of which there seemed to have been some evidence there back last year that the Secretary of State, Huma Abedin, were arranging special meetings or special opportunities to be able to talk to the Secretary of State or to get some kind of special privileges based upon contributions to the Trump or to the Clinton Foundation. Again, all kinds of allegations. Don't have a lot of detail on that. But clearly, if in fact Trump is making foreign policy decisions based upon how it might personally, financially benefit him, that like in China, for example, even Ivanka seems to be now getting special privileges in terms of sort of expedited processes for what, copyrights and so forth like that, and for some of her designs. That could possibly be construed as bribery, especially if it's being done for the purposes, as I mentioned to you, for trying to what? Exchange something of value in return for official government service or favors. And so that becomes a possibility. Additionally, there is also this clause out there that almost nobody paid attention to until very recently, is that it's Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8. The Constitution says that no person holding any office or profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of Congress, accept any present, emolument, office, or title of any kind whatsoever from any king, prince, or foreign state, the emolument clause. And if we go back and look at the history of that clause, it was because, not a surprise, James Madison and our framers were very, very worried about what? About foreign interference in the young United States government. We're worried about efforts by eventually Great Britain and about France to try to interfere in our elections or our political system. And so they were concerned and put this clause in here. For some of you who might remember your history a little bit, in the 1790s, this clause actually took on some meaning because there's the famous what? XYZ affair, in terms of which we still have no idea who X, Y, and Z were in France, but clearly efforts were made by the French government to try to essentially what? To try to offer gifts or to try to influence the American government in a variety of ways. But the whole purpose of the clause was what? The whole purpose was to try to prevent foreign governments from trying to have adverse interference or adverse influence upon the United States. What's critical about this is notice that the phrase says that from any king, prince, or foreign state. Simply getting gifts from private businesses isn't an emolument. That might be bribery, but it's not an emolument. But what if, for example, Trump were to get gifts or goodies from what? A state-owned enterprise. China has state-owned enterprises. Many other countries in the world have state-owned enterprises. Many countries from around the world actually might actually be interested in trying to have some influence. It is possible that if in fact that is occurring, violation of that clause is an impeachable offense. It would fit under perhaps bribery. It could fit under also, I would argue, is the third grounds for actually impeaching the President of the United States. The phrase that most of us know, high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, what does high crimes, or what does the phrase high crimes and misdemeanor mean? Well, again, we have to do a little bit of history here in terms of putting some context here. And this is a term, guess what, that goes back a long, long way. It goes back to approximately the 1300s in England. I think it's 1356, if I remember correctly, in terms of, actually 1386, when Parliament, an English Parliament, used the phrase high crimes and misdemeanors to refer to a variety of different actions. They included it to have it to refer to misappropriation of funds, maladministration in office, dereliction of official duties, a whole bunch of different things.